Good evening. I'm John Batchelor. This is The John Batchelor Show. Gordon Chang, my colleague and co-host, joins me. We turn to a new threat on planet Earth. Within these last days, the Pentagon is announcing that China, the Communist Party runs the PLA and the PLA Navy, has turned from a Navy that is defensive into a Navy that is offensive, with a submarine contingent, 3 submarines, that are capable of launching ballistic nuclear weapons. This is a decision made by the leadership in China, and we call upon Rick Fisher. Rick is a senior fellow at the International Assessment and Strategy Center to comment on why the PLA Navy believes it is necessary to put ballistic missile weapons at sea, underwater, undetectable, in an era in which China's economy, China's growth, the miracle of China, depends upon its relations with other countries. Richard, a very good evening to you. This is odd, isn't it? Here we are in the 21st century, post-Cold War, and suddenly something called the Type 94 is at sea. There are 3 of them. There could be more. And they're carrying, 12 missiles each? Each of those missiles are quite capable of ending life as we know it. Good evening to you, Richard.
Good evening, John. Thanks for having me on it. Yes, indeed. 3 Type 094s have been launched. They carry 12 single warhead missiles each with a range sufficient to cover Alaska from the Yellow Sea, or if they conduct patrols off of the eastern coast of North Korea, they could reach Seattle and the very important American strategic ballistic missile submarine base nearby.
So, Richard, if we go back 3 or 4 years, there was the thought that basically Beijing's political leaders didn't trust the military. So what they did was they stored their warheads separately from the launchers. But when you have deterrence patrols, which is what these are, or maybe even their first strike patrols, who knows? Obviously, you've got to have the warheads on the missiles, in the tubes, in the submarines, right?
Absolutely. And they have to have a safeguard method, probably multiple keys or multiple codes, with heavy coverage by political warfare officers, to ensure that the party's demands are carried out directly and precisely.
To understand this, I learned that the Central Military Commission, those are the big bosses in the Communist Party's PLA, they use the 2nd Artillery Corps with nuclear weapons. Many of those missiles, we believe, are buried in tunnels deep into the west of China. That is centralized control. That's command authority. But when you put nuclear weapons on ballistic missiles at sea, that is not the same model. Isn't that a problem, Richard, for command and control?
Well, it hasn't been a problem for the American, Russian, Soviet, British, or French navies. And I don't think that it will be a real problem for the Chinese Navy. The officers that they put aboard these submarines will most likely be well brainwashed or well trained, and there will be sufficient overlap, redundant officers watching control of these missiles to ensure that there's no such thing as an accidental launch or a rebellion launch against the Communist Party.
I, of course, immediately think of Sean Connery in The Hunt for Red October, how he overcame the political officer with a twist of his neck, and so I suggest that Hollywood's already been there. Gordon?
Richard, not only that, when you have ballistic missile submarines at sea, you need to communicate with them. We do so, I guess, through land-based antenna and also planes that go out into the sea with these long antennae that trail behind them. Do we know how the Chinese plan to communicate with their ballistic missile submarines?
Well, Gordon, the Americans also use a very low-frequency communication antenna buried in the ground that is sending out continuous messages globally. The Chinese have the same kind of system in addition to the ones that you mentioned, airborne, land-based, and the such. And at least early on, their submarines are not expected to be operating very far from the territory of China. So if you're in the Bohai Sea or the Yellow Sea or operating off of Hainan Island in the South China Sea, sticking an antenna up is a safe thing to do because you'll be within a protected area.
And we have submarines, attack submarines, which are actually quite good. What is our capability to kill China's ballistic missile submarines?
Well, the problem of shallow water patrol areas cuts both ways. It makes China's submarines vulnerable in the Bohai and Yellow Seas, which are very shallow, but it also makes it very difficult for the Americans to conceal themselves as well, to go get those submarines. In deeper waters, the fight is more balanced to the Americans because of our specialty in submarine stealth. We have the quietest submarines out there today. But by the time China moves into a future generation of submarines expected in the 2020s, my guess is that they also expect to have a final solution with Taiwan, as horrible as that is to consider, because the PLA very much covets Taiwan, if for anything, to be a future SSBN base, because the eastern coast of Taiwan offers immediate access to some of the deepest waters in the Pacific.
This looks like an arms race in Asia. I recall the Japanese talking about a submarine fleet, shifting their defense posture away from Russia in the north and looking to the first island chain and launching a submarine fleet. What kind of submarine fleet? Do we know? Have the Japanese filled it in? Are they going to put boomers out there, or are they going to put submarine hunters?
The Japanese Navy already has a very well-developed competency in anti-submarine warfare. They have very competent destroyers, anti-submarine warfare aircraft that we have sold them, plus what they've developed themselves, and their submarines, conventional non-nuclear powered submarines, are amongst the best in the world and designed to emphasize anti-submarine warfare. The problem for the Japanese is they don't have very many of them. They're intending to build, I think, up to about 20 or 22 over the course of this decade. Right now, the PLA has close to 50 modern submarines that it could use to flood East Asia if it wanted to.
Gordon, a question for you. Does the Chinese Communist Party leadership mean to threaten us with these submarines? Is that their first intention?
It probably is, John, because, it's not just a question of deterrence. They already have deterrence. What this does is it gives them a first strike capability. And that's what really worries a lot of people these days, because the Chinese may not be those benign little creatures that people in Washington think they are.
Rick, as I recall, the three legs of the stool, it was the bombers, the missiles, and the submarines. And the submarines were the most protected of all, the most effective of all, because it was impossible to imagine you could find them. Is that what the PLA has put together, three legs of the stool for for nuclear weapons?
The third leg, bombers, is coming along, John. It is widely thought that the Shan Aircraft Corporation, their main bomber designer manufacturer, is working on a flying wing design similar to the American Northrop Grumman B-2 bomber. It is very interesting that the Russians have just chosen a flying wing design for their next generation bomber. My suspicion is that the Russians may have been consulting for the Chinese and investing those profits in their own bomber program. I wouldn't be surprised if they looked rather similar once they emerged.
Have I gone too far here? Are the Russians threatened by this launch, not just us?
The Russians indeed are very threatened by China's broad military developments, especially their vast investments in large, modern mechanized forces. The Russians, however, are doing something very efficient and I would also say intelligent. They're investing in tactical nuclear weapons. It's rumored that they call these tactical nuclear weapons pest control. And they intend to use them on their own territory if and when the Chinese invade. But they don't have the resources to match the Chinese brigade for brigade, so they're investing in TAC nukes.
Rick Fisher, a senior fellow at the International Assessment and Strategy Center. Gordon, China's economy is weakening. There's real panic in Beijing about the GDP growth, about the promises to the people, about unemployment. China's weaker. That, in history, is when they get aggressive.
That could very well be, because they are falling back on nationalism, which means increasing friction with their neighbors.
The Chinese now have a missile boat capable of launching intercontinental ballistic missiles, solid fuel. That is not Cold War talk. That's 21st century. Gordon Chang of Forbes.com. I'm John Batchelor.